Welcome on board the RichPlanet starship, broadcasting from somewhere high above the Earth. I'm Richard.D.Hall. On this week's show, for a fourth appearance, to talk about what has been described by an English professor as the most important book of the 21st century, Where Did the Towers Go?, written by former Professor of Mechanical Engineering, Dr. Judy Wood. I'd like to welcome back 9/11 Truth campaigner, Andrew Johnson. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks for inviting me back, Richard.
It's a pleasure. Now, I've got Dr. Judy Wood's book here, Andrew, which you're going to talk about today. And how long has Judy been working on this, Andrew?
Well, I mean, essentially that book, you could sort of argue, is the result of, you know, almost 10 years of research, because Dr. Wood, if you go and listen to some of the broadcasts she's done, she describes how she was very suspicious on the very day that it happened that it wasn't as we were shown. There was something very seriously wrong. And you know, she can obviously tell that story much better than I can, but she began to publish research sort of to share with a couple of people that she was speaking to in about sort of 2004, and has developed it, and the website, the current website, was essentially started in about early 2007 or late 2006. So you know, she's been really working on it for at least intensively for at least 4 years in the sort of form that it's developed into now.
So what's her qualifications first? Right.
Well, yes. I mean, she's basically a professor of mechanical engineering. She's got specialism in materials engineering science and engineering mechanics. And then she ended up specialising in what's called interference techniques, particularly optics, which is what you use for stress analysis. In other words, you want to test materials and how they'll respond to various loads. And some of her research was involved with biomaterials, and how they would behave under stress.
All right. Now, the book itself is predominantly about what happened to the buildings after the attacks had occurred on 9/11. It doesn't concern itself too much with the actual, we'll call them impacts. But why did the towers disappear, for want of a better word? And we'll go into it in a little more detail later on. But does Judy Wood not travel around the world? I mean, you were telling me why she couldn't be in the UK.
Well, I mean, we've done this at quite short notice, this particular programme. It's difficult to get her over here due to the expense, and she's also got certain commitments where she is at the moment, so it would be difficult to bring her over to do a broadcast here. You know, we thought of doing it over Skype. I think I discussed that with you, but that's not ideal. All
right. Now, the subtitle of the book is Evidence of Directed Free Energy Technology on 9/11, and we'll go into some detail shortly. But just broadly, in my opinion, there are three broad theories on what happened to the towers on the day of 9/11. Now, the first one, which is held by victims of mainstream media brainwashing, is that the alleged planes, caused structural damage and fires, which then caused these quarter-mile-high steel structures to just fall like pancakes. That's the first theory, which most people who look at 9/11 for more than 10 minutes realize that that's just
bullshit detected.
Bullshit.
Take precautions.
Now, the other two broad theories, I would suggest, are firstly that the towers were rigged with explosives, conventional explosives, which created a standard controlled demolition. And I would say, out of people who are demanding 9/11 truth, it's probably the favoured viewpoint. Now, there's another viewpoint, which is, well, it's not another viewpoint. Dr. Judy Wood has looked at the evidence, and this is it's a study. It's probably the most detailed scientific study of the evidence. Would you say that's correct, Andrew?
Absolutely. I mean, the book itself runs to 500 pages. You know, and you'll find about 800 pictures, various graphs.
800 pictures, which are all annotated.
Yeah, pretty much, or most of them are, you know, many of them are
annotated.
annotated.
It's a textbook, essentially,
yeah,
isn't it?
It's essentially done as a textbook,
but
it's written in a very readable style. So, you know, you're going to find a catalogue of evidence in there, which is what takes it away from being a viewpoint. It's actually a study of evidence, not a viewpoint.
All right.
And if you look at some of these other sort of studies, they only focus on a very small number of phenomena, such as red chips in dust, or certain properties of hot materials, which, when you look at them, are not found in the overall evidence that you'll find in that book.
Right. Now, obviously, it's how many pages is it, Andrew? It's 500 pages.
Yeah, basically.
And 800 photographs. So it's a highly detailed piece of work,
Correct.
which we haven't got time to go into on a show which is an hour long. But one of the central themes is that the steel and concrete and glass and people that made up these buildings went from being in one state to turning to dust.
Yes, correct.
That's probably the main thrust of this book.
Yeah, essentially. Yeah.
So can you elaborate on this dustification, if that is the word? And we can also show some images of the point in time when the towers seemingly turned to dust. Can you just explain that process for us?
Absolutely. I mean, again, this is one of those things. When I initially saw this, I bought the official story hook, line and sinker for about 3 years, and it wasn't really until 3 years after that, in other words, around about sort of 2006, that it was pointed out to me that the buildings did indeed turn to dust, and not just the buildings, but all of their contents. And we saw, you can go and watch the video again, and hopefully we'll be able to overlay a clip here.
There is a clip of the spire.
Yes.
So is that a spire of the actual Twin Towers then?
Yes, I mean, there's this clip which has come to be known as the spire, and what it actually is 70 columns of unsupported steel, which is the remains of Tower 1.
So why do you say unsupported steel? What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, it was actually part of the central part of the building, which remained after all the other the rest of the building.
So it was a question of central core columns?
Yes, yes, several central core columns.
Right.
I believe there were central core columns, or if they weren't the central core columns, they were close to where the central core was. And
so are these like 3-inch box section steel type columns?
Yeah, and you can actually see these turning to dust.
They just turn to dust?
Yeah, they just turn to dust.
In that particular image that we see, these steel core columns turn to dust. That could not happen if it had been controlled demolition.
No, because when you rig something with explosives, you will see chunks flying, you will see flames, you will see things flying apart. If you watch that clip, you see none of those things happening. You don't see anything exploding, you don't see anything flying apart, and you don't see anything in flames. You literally see this steel turn from a grid structure into dust. So you're looking at a completely different process.
All right. Now, the subtitle of the book mentions free energy technology. All right. So that's suggesting then that it was free energy technology that was used. Would you call it a weapon?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically energy that's used as a weapon and directed. So it's a directed energy weapon.
Right.
And as Dr. Wood says herself, when she first started looking at the evidence, she didn't even know that directed energy weapons existed. She'd never heard of them because it wasn't her area of research or interest. But when she catalogued all these phenomena in the evidence, she realised that she was looking at essentially two things. One, it was an energy phenomenon she was looking at, and the second thing, it was to do with what's called interference, which was her area of expertise in terms of interferometry.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, I don't want to stray too much off the evidence in the book. I want to keep on to it. But just quickly, you've got organisations such as Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, and the guy who runs that is, you tell me his name?
Richard Gage.
Richard Gage. Yes. Now, he gives talks and presentations on what some people would consider a conspiracy theory, which is that there was a controlled demolition.
Yes.
Right. Now, so you've got these supposedly educated people who hold this, who will claim that it was controlled demolition, it was explosives. So you would say that this book just completely rules out such theories?
Correct.
But they're academic people, Andrew, so how would you answer that claim?
Well, I mean, basically, the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth group, they have actually said in writing that they will only consider certain types of evidence in their discussion, and they will not consider other types of evidence, and therefore they rule out the study of the evidence which is in that, a lot of which is in that book.
Right.
So they don't talk about any of the energy effects. They don't really talk about the buildings turning to powder as such. They'll mention it, but they won't try and explain it.
Right. So, I mean, why is that? Why don't they consider the scientific evidence?
Well, that's a very good question. I'd like to know the answer to that. We've recently had a friend of ours who joined the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth petition. His name is Abraham Hafiz Rodriguez, and he actually didn't know, he found out about Dr. Wood's research privately, and he wrote to Richard Gage and said, have you ever heard of Dr. Judy Wood? Have you looked at the evidence that's on her website? And that's all he sent to Richard Gage. A few days later, he discovered that his name had been deleted from their petition list. And even though he'd given them $100 with no explanation. So he was doing that in all honesty, that he didn't think the group had heard about Dr. Wood's research, but in actuality they had. And as a reward for him mentioning it to them, they deleted him off their list. So you have to consider, why would they want to do that? And my answer to that would be that they don't want people to become aware of the connection between energy and what happened at the World Trade Center.
So just staying on the conspiracy for a second, you explained to me that you've got the majority of people who still believe the crazy official story.
Correct.
Then you've got people who are finding
Skeptical.
out that there's something not right with it, and they would generally go to the thermite-controlled demolition theory. So, but you think that there's a move by whoever behind the scenes to then control that group and mop up as many people in that group so that they're not getting to the truth of what really happened.
Correct.
All right, and so those groups are possibly being steered, manipulated.
I mean, essentially, if you study it, you just have to look at what they've done in terms of any real investigation. All that group is doing is going around and collecting names of people. Okay. If you go and look at their websites about how many people have signed the petition to ask for a new investigation. Now that's the key thing. They're asking for a new investigation. They're not doing one themselves. Right. And that book is
an investigation.
It is the new investigation, and that's the title that's been given to it. It is the new investigation of the destruction of the World Trade Center, done by a qualified scientist. And should you choose to get hold of that book, or even just look at the website, that is what you're looking at. You're looking at the new investigation. And some of that evidence has already been sent into a court case, submitted in a court case, as I think we discussed in a prior programme.
So no serious 9/11 researcher can say they've done their homework until they've read this book?
Correct.
All right. Now, just one final point on the controlled demolition thing that I want to ask you about, Andrew. One of the photographs that people who support this is a column which has got the steel seemingly cut at I don't know what angle it is, about 45
degrees, yeah, something like that.
And they say that this is common when carrying out a controlled demolition, that the columns are pre-cut and then have explosives put next to them, which then go off. And so how do you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, this comes up quite commonly, that we see this picture with the fireman next to it, stroking his chin, and we don't know whether he's involved with that cutting exercise or whatever. And yes, it looks like the steel column has been cut off at an angle. Now, it's my understanding that is quite clearly from an oxyacetylene torch. And my understanding is that actually that photograph has been cropped, and you're not actually seeing the rest of the oxyacetylene equipment in the other section of the photograph, which has not been shown. But even if we take it, let's just say for the sake of argument that that is the result of a thermite charge that was planted. The problem with that is that it doesn't explain what happened on the rest of the site. It doesn't explain why the buildings turned to powder, and we mentioned the spiral. It doesn't explain that.
Yeah. And I mean, this powder was seemed to spew out for miles and miles and miles. And
Correct.
I mean, the people claiming compensation who breathed it in.
Correct.
I'm not digressing from the book a little bit, but is it not just a case of measuring the size of the particles to say this was something not like a controlled demolition because of the size of the particles.
Right. Well, actually, this is one of those things. If you get the book, you'll see that some of that is discussed in the book, the particle size and the way that the dust was distributed and that sort of thing. That some of that information is in the book with some of the research that was published about that. And I think there's a study by I think it's Thomas Cahill. I think some of his study will be in the book. But then you get people trying to twist that into supporting, say, the thermite theory. But the problem with that is that the thermite doesn't turn things to dust. It burns things and melts things. It doesn't turn things into dust.
All right. Okay, well, we're going to go for a short break now, Andrew. And after the break, we're going to look at some of the unusual phenomenon that were observed around the site on the day of 9/11. Welcome back on board the Starship, and we're talking to Andrew Johnson about Dr. Judy Wood's new book, Where Did the Towers Go? And this book was described by Professor Eric Larson as the most important book of the 21st century. So who's Eric Larson, Andrew?
Right, yeah, well, he's a professor of English. He's retired now, but he basically has written a book called A Nation Gone Blind, which is basically about how Americans are having difficulty seeing all the problems in society that have been created over the last 20 or 30 years, with the things like the creation of the Patriot Act and all that side of things. And I think because he'd written about some of those topics, I don't know the full story, but Dr. Judy got in touch with Eric Larson and they started to correspond, and then he was ultimately asked to help edit the book and write the foreword, which he said he was honoured to do, and that was his response. He felt that once he'd seen the evidence, and this is a professor of English, he's not a scientist, but he could clearly see from the study what the significance was.
All right, well, in addition to the actual dust, which doesn't tie in with controlled demolition, there were a whole range of other bizarre phenomena.
That's right.
Now, where are we going to start, Andrew?
Well, I mean, some of my favourites, for example, are the upturned cars. I quite often go to this one first because to me it's one of the most immediately inexplicable ones. When you see a row of cars and you've got most of them are the right way up, and then there's one that's the wrong way up. I mean, how do you explain that? So people will look at it and say, well, obviously, Andrew, what happened was, there was a blast of wind from the towers coming down, and that turned the car upside down. Well, if that was the case, then why a few feet away on some of the pictures do you have all the leaves on the trees? Because if you've got a wind strong enough to turn a car upside down, it's going to blow the leaves off the trees. Right. And this sort of thing, or blow the branches off the trees, and none of those things were seen.
Now, there were damage to cars which seemed to have heat damage in one section of the car's bodywork, with right next to it no heat damage at all. Let's just say it was an energy weapon. This weapon seems to have been selective over the areas that it's having an effect on. So can you expand on that, Andrew?
Well, this was something which, Dr. Wood recognised early on because of her experience with interferometry. Now, for those that are not familiar with this technique of interferometry, it's where you get two sort of light sources, for example, or in fact you get the same light source, a coherent source of light, such as a laser beam. You split the beam using a diffraction grating, and then you recombine the beam with mirrors, and then you make the length of the path one wavelength different, and you'll get constructive and destructive interferences.
Anyone who's done O-level physics or A-level physics will know about interference fringes, and constructive and destructive interference.
That's right.
So the two beams create a whole sequence of almost on, off, or effect, no effect, effect, no effect.
That's right.
Crests and troughs.
Yeah, that's right. Right. Exactly.
So she believes that these, what I just described earlier, with that part's affected and that part isn't, it's an interference fringe pattern.
That's exactly right, and this is what was seen, for example, where there were regions where the cars essentially were all parked in a line or in the parking lot, for example, car park, and you will see a pattern of damage where there's regions where there's heavy damage, and then next to that there's regions where there's no damage, and then further along there's more damage. So you're seeing this as an interference effect, with destructive interference in one place and constructive interference in another place.
All right. So what about jellified metal?
Yeah,
You
I mean,
describe
this
it
is
as jellified.
Yeah, jellification. This is basically metal which seems to have melted, but apart from the melting, there's no other evidence of heat. You know, there's no charring, there's no burning, there's none of the effects that you would normally get with the heating metal otherwise. And you've got materials merged together, such as metal and paper, have kind of like merged together into a single blob.
So as if
without the
something
paper
at an
being
atomic
burned.
level has been going on.
Correct, correct.
Right.
And this is where Dr. Wood eventually tied this in with what's known as the Hutchison effect, because both the interference effects and the jellification are what's seen with John Hutchison's experiments. There's several other effects which have been documented as well.
Mm-hmm.
So this is where, the jellification is essentially an energy effect, because you're seeing effects on the metal, but with an absence of heat, which, how do you change metal without heat?
Now, John Hutchison is, I don't know if you would say a controversial character, but someone who perhaps isn't part of mainstream science, who did experiments in the 1980s with microwaves and other generators, and, as you claim, was visited by Colonel John Alexander. So you believe that the Hutchison effect was something similar going on to what's happened in 9/11?
Yes,
What would you say to people who say, well, no, this Hutchison guy is just a crank who was twiddling knobs and doing faked videos? Or, are you not tainting the evidence by even bringing his name into it?
Right. Well, this is what has been claimed, and in fact, the way that you've put that is what's certain members of the 9/11 Truth, quote unquote, movement have said exactly the same thing. The problem is that really, when you look at the effects that John has repeatedly demonstrated over the years, and then see those reproduced in the evidence, that really seals the case. Now, so it's not so much to do with his education, but it's to do with the effects that he's able to create. And if people go onto the internet and Google his name, they'll typically come up with a Wikipedia page. And on that Wikipedia page, it claims that John Hutchison is not able to reproduce his effects, which is untrue. I mean, we've seen, for example, a video taken in 2007 where he was visited by Rob Simone and his friend. They were making a video, and he demonstrated levitation to them. Within probably half an hour or an hour, he was able to reproduce, and this is on film. It's not a particularly clear example, but you can see it. You can see it happen. So, and John Alexander makes no secret that he visited John Hutchison. He talks about it. I've got audio of him talking about it. So it's not a claim that he visited him. He did actually visit him, and he spent 4 months working with him.
And another of the bizarre effects, if we just move off the Hutchison effect, is these circular holes, which we've discussed in the past on a previous show. I mean, what does Judy Wood make of these circular holes, which appear to be, they don't appear to be just damage done by something which has just collapsed. They look like they've been punched in, for want of a better word. Right. What does she conclude about the holes? Or what does she say about the holes?
Right. Well, just to sort of clarify the description a little bit, if you look at World Trade Center Building 6, you'll find pictures in the book and on the website of World Trade Center Building 6, and you'll see these circular holes in the tops of the building, and also they appear to be in the street and in the other sort of regions of damage in the building which have a circular effect within that damage. You don't the holes in the top of World Trade Center 6 do seem quite circular, but there's other areas where you can see the circular hole, but it's within the debris pile. Right. So it's not like crystal clear, but once you can see it, it's definitely there. And originally it was considered that, obviously, when you're looking at something like that, you're looking at it as if it's something above the buildings that's caused these holes, some type of, something, maybe even, she originally sort of suggested in the original broadcast, which caused all the controversy, that this thing might be orbital, but she didn't actually say it was, and she didn't know if it was.
So she was asked, where
it was,
is this alleged energy weapon located?
Right.
And she replied that it might be orbital.
Correct.
Which then created, a kind of a reaction from certain people who say, this is crazy space beams. Was the words
It
used.
was misquoted. That was never actually said by Judy, Dr. Judy, but yeah, it was then taken that she had said that.
So that was then used as a kind of a lot of people who were reporting on various 9/11 researchers' work would then not touch this work or not look at this work because it was people were using this word space beam to discredit the work.
Right.
Or the analysis.
Correct. And that was taken up by Steve Jones. He used that description to try and...
Okay, now for me, that doesn't seem so implausible. This is just my own personal view. I'm not referring to the book here. We've got hundreds of satellites in space that beam down tons of, well, not tons, but vast amounts of data in radio waves. I mean, they're all over, they're in orbit. Now, it doesn't seem a huge leap of the imagination to be able to do the same with a microwave and cause damage with it. You know, so I'm not saying it's microwaves, but all I'm saying is that to me, I mean, we know what damaged lasers can do, for example. You know, it doesn't seem to me to be beyond the bounds of reason to be able to put something in space which can cause damage to a building. I mean, that's not crazy at all in my view.
Right.
So, and I'm not speaking for Dr. Judy Wood when I'm saying that. I'm speaking for myself, my own thoughts on it. So for her to be ridiculed because all she said was, well, it might be orbital, seems just, you know, ridiculous.
That's right. I mean, it was taken out of context, and it wasn't, you know, and you've made some valid points there that we do know. I mean, you know, we had, and the way that it was really misinterpreted was because she essentially, you know, just went a little way from what you said and talked about the SDI program, the Strategic Defence Initiative. Yes. And she was essentially arguing that a lot of classified technology was developed then, and possibly we might be looking at some piece of technology from that, which was involved in these events. She didn't say that's exactly what happened, but she was just, you know, there was evidence that those weapons could have been developed in the SDI program. Yeah. And then those two things were put together and taken out of context, and that's what's been then used, as you said, to put a lot of people off. But since all that has been going on and on and on, it's never gone away, and it probably never will go away. But for example, if you look at some of John Hutchison's experiments, he's actually had some of his samples have had circular holes in them, but he hasn't been using like a microwave beam above his experiment. He's been using it, creating those holes using interference effects. Right.
So let's just talk about this briefly then. The actual, if it's a free energy weapon or energy weapon, then the weapon must be housed somewhere. Now, let's speculate as to... I know Judy doesn't speculate in her book. She looks at the evidence, but if we can do that, I mean, where could it be? I mean, we were discussing this before the show, and you said that it might only be the size of a suitcase.
Yeah, well, this again is my speculation, because what John Hutchison does is he has 2 tons of equipment, or he had until he sold it a few months ago. He had 2 tons of equipment, which is, you know, microwave generators, radar equipment, ex-Navy equipment, and he was beaming his sample area with these various types of energies, frequencies and amplitudes of various wavelengths, particularly, you know, with microwave frequencies being involved, and he was essentially creating these effects. He also used electrostatics and magnetic fields as well. So, you know...
So these were placed around the object then?
Yeah, around a region. I mean, essentially, if you think of a region the size of this table we've got here in the studio, that was a sort of sample area that he would put a piece of metal in, or several metal samples, and he would, the generators would surround that region, and then the effects would be created within that region.
So there could be 4 buildings a quarter of a mile away with 4 devices in them. With something else. It could be in a plane or a helicopter. Yeah. So you basically don't... And I guess this is part of the problem for getting people on board with this analysis, is that you can't pinpoint where the alleged weapon was.
This is one of the things, you know, people want to jump to the answer because we're so used to having things pre-packed. You know, you're given an answer, you spoon-fed it, right, on to the next thing. You know, this is not like this. This is a pretty complicated set of circumstances which we're looking at.
I guess what you're trying to gather evidence for something which has never been disclosed before.
This is it. I mean, you imagine you know, I think the analogy that Dr. Wood makes is that you imagine some backward culture who find a dead body in their midst, but they don't know what a gun is. and they've never seen a gun, they've never heard it described, and they see this dead body with a mysterious hole in it. So they've got to try and work out what the gun looks like and what the bullet looked like, and if the bullet's gone through the body and gone elsewhere. That's essentially what you're dealing with here. You're looking for something which you've never seen before in this form of a weapon, and all that you've got is this something which is quite similar in many respects, which has been called the Hutchison effect.
Yes,
and it has all the same
I believe she
characteristics.
links in Tesla with this as well.
That's right, because John Hutchison was working on some of Tesla's experiments, and Tesla, as you may know, was looking at something called radiant energy, exploiting the radiant energy field. In other words, Tesla essentially found out that energy is all around us. All we need to do, essentially, like we tune in a radio to a radio station, if we can tune in an energy antenna to the radiant energy, we can draw it out from the ether.
Sometimes known as 0 point energy.
That's another. Yes,
right.
that's another.
So, I mean, I'm just going to ask you about that. As we said earlier, the title is Evidence of Directed Free Energy Technology.
Right.
Now, what makes you, or Dr. Judy Wood, believe that it was free energy, i.e., energy which is breaking the first law of thermodynamics, where the energy is coming from the quantum vacuum itself? It's not coming from energy stored in a nuclear reaction or thermal energy. It's coming from the space, quantum vacuum. So that's my brief explanation of it. But why do you think it is free energy technology and not just energy technology?
Well, I mean, basically, the way that I would answer that question, I'm not sure if it's exactly the same as the way Dr. Wood would answer it, but I think we're sort of on fairly similar ground here, in that if you look at the change in the materials needed, in other words, if you before going to the tails, let's take one of John Hutchison's metal samples, and you can see that if you were to change that metal sample in the way that is shown, it would need a lot of energy to do it, and yet the energy that's been input into the equipment is only a few hundred watts. Yet if you induce that same change by using heat, you might need several thousand watts, but yet you've only put in maybe a few watts, maybe a few tens of watts. So you've had this huge change in the material, but with only a small amount of input energy. So in other words, energy is needed to change the material. Where has the energy come from? It hasn't come out of the equipment. It's come from somewhere else.
Is it not possible that the weapon, the reaction that it is inducing, is using the energy already held within the molecular bonds of the towers? So it's not actually free energy. It's like a nuclear reaction where it self-perpetuates.
Right.
So it's perhaps destroying a small amount of mass to create energy, and it's a chain reaction rather than free energy.
Right.
Would that? I mean,
that's right. I mean, again,
how do you know it's free energy and not just a different form of chain reaction?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, and I mean, I think the way I would answer that is that if the energy that is changing the material is coming out of the material itself, then it's an energy source within it. It's got its own intrinsic energy source. So I think that we can show. I mean, if you look at, for example, cold fusion or low energy nuclear reactions, as it's called, that seems to be, from our studies, a similar phenomenon is involved. And as I may have mentioned before, we think, and I think, that is why, I certainly think that is why Steve Jones was involved, because he knew about cold fusion. That's why he became involved in 9/11 research, because an energy phenomenon was involved.
Just for the audience, Steve Jones wrote a paper which was probably the main piece of evidence which supports the controlled demolition thermite argument.
That's right.
And you have found that he was involved very closely with,
Eugene
Malov, who was murdered for producing or investigating certain results of cold fusion. I mean,
correct.
There's a whole conspiracy around cold fusion, which we're probably straying off the point here. But you believe that Steve Jones was, well, tell us.
If you follow that up, you'll see there is a connection there, and I've written about this in some of the articles on my website. So this is kind of like the other side of the story, and how that what the research that Dr. Judy has done, that kind of links into this other side of the energy question, which I strongly advise people investigate for themselves in relation to cold fusion, low energy nuclear reactions, and Steve Jones.
So the theory that you would put forward is that Steve Jones is basically a disinformation agent working for the authorities to try and promote the thermite argument.
Right.
And you would back that up by saying he was involved in covering up the cold fusion.
He was, essentially, if you look at what he did with the cold fusion research, he's done a very similar job with the 9/11 research. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Andrew, we're going to go for another short break, but we've got 500 pages to get through, so we might be here for some time. Welcome back on board the Starship. I'm talking with Andrew Johnson about Dr. Judy Wood's new book, Where Did the Towers Go? Now, Andrew, there are some very gruesome facts about 9/11, and one of those is the fact that people were jumping out the windows. Now, I find that part of the story very curious, because a lot of people who were seen to jump out the windows didn't seem to be in any immediate danger. They were several floors above where there seemed to be fires. So I can't imagine anyone jumping out of a window to their death unless they were near death in the first, they were trying to avoid something. It doesn't seem to add up to me that there was so. I mean, have you recorded how many people actually jumped out of the windows?
Well, I mean, again, this is one of the things that people have probably some awareness of in relation to the events of 9/11. But it's like you say, it's very gruesome, and people don't really want to talk about the jumper issue. Now, I think it's generally assumed that about 40 people jumped. Mm-hmm. But again, if you go and read the responder testimonies, in other words, the first responder testimonies, such as the emergency medical technicians and the firemen, who were actually at the buildings, after these first events had happened and before the buildings came down, they said it was raining people. That's how they described it. Right. You're hearing people coming down, sort of 3 or 4 people a minute.
You could hear them hitting the ground.
Yeah, you could hear them crashing through the glass, near the bottom where they had the sort of glass structures at the bottom, towards the bottom of the towers. So they were sort of walking around, and very, very gruesome scene, obviously, for people to be involved with. And I think Dr. Judy has done some calculations, and the calculations basically came out based on the frequency that the firemen were giving in their witness testimonies, and there's several of these, as 1,500. I think around about 1,500 people jumped. That
seems high. I mean, how many people were alleged to? Was it 4,000 people died?
3,000 were alleged to have died,
right.
But I think they claim to have identified. Again, the figures are in the book. I think again they claim to have identified about 1,500.
All right.
But that was from the people that were coming. They couldn't identify the people that were just turned to dust.
Right.
There was no DNA left.
All right. So a lot of people jumped out the windows.
Correct.
Now, does Dr. Judy Wood go into the evidence as to why they did this?
Yes, she does. Or she puts forward from the pictorial evidence, for example, one of the key things that she noticed, which is easy to overlook, is that some of these people had various parts of their clothes removed as they were jumping out. Some had shirts hanging off them or trousers taken down. Some quite unusual things that you wouldn't expect people to be taking their clothes off as they were trying to get out of the window or jump out of the window. So, basically what this appears to be is that these people were excruciatingly hot for some reason, yet they're not burned.
Right.
In other words, they don't have any fire burns on their body. They were being made hot for some other reason.
Right. Because if we accept that there's an energy weapon, you would contend that it wasn't just at the moment of collapse when the weapon was fired.
Yes.
It was continually being beamed, or I won't use that word, but operated on.
Exactly. And then to go back to the theme of the book, Dr. Judy will show you different phenomena using different bits of evidence. For example, to use what we're talking about, it seems that the building was being prepped. Right. They were acting on the building for about an hour before it was actually destroyed. There was some process going on in the building. Yes. Now, this
And that was affecting these people who
Correct,
then jumped out the
correct.
window. So,
So
like
if you
maybe
ima-
like being inside a microwave oven.
Exactly, exactly. It appears that microwaves were involved as part of this. That's not to say that they were heating it up like a microwave oven meal. It wasn't quite the same as that because, for example, they may have used some other techniques to modify the way the beam was operating.
Right.
But just to go back to the prepping of the building, the other evidence is what's called lathering. In other words, these clouds of fumes which came out of one side of the building, for a long time, and they're clearly not smoke. It's like the building is being dissolved over a period of time from the inside out, and then the final stage when most of the building had actually been processed, if you will, and the final sort of dustification process that we saw was just the last stage of that.
Right.
And behind that aluminium facade, most of the building had already been basically, decomposed almost.
Yeah, you need a new word. I
Yeah,
know
yeah.
Dr. Judy Wood, does come up with a new set of vocabulary
That's right,
to
she
describe
does.
some of the
Exactly.
effects.
Exactly, because she didn't want to bias the observations by saying things like smoke, fire. Instead of saying smoke and fire, she'll say fumes for smoke, and weird fires is what we've ended up calling them. We can't think of another word for fire, but she ended up calling them weird fires, which appear to be, people are walking through these fires and not getting burned. We have another of the emergency medical technicians, her coat bursts into flames. And I think even her hair gets set on fire, but she's not burned. The next day, there's no burn marks on her at all.
All right. Right, now, let's just come on to the publishing of this book, Andrew.
Right.
Because it is a very, very important, if not the most important book to come out on 9/11. We've got to recognise that.
Yes.
And there are going to be a lot of people who will deny the evidence in this book.
Right.
Because it doesn't sit comfortably with the theory that they have come to accept.
Exactly.
But people must look at this book. And there's been a little bit of a problem with the publishing of it, Andrew.
That's right.
Because there was a previous version.
That's right.
So
I mean, if I can talk about that for a couple of minutes. If you go onto the internet and do a Google search for the title of that book, you may well find, certainly in this country, in the UK, for example, I checked this a couple of days ago, and you'll find the book listed on W.H. Smith's, Waterston's, and another site, Abe Books, I think it was called. But if you go and write to those websites, you'll find the book is not available. And in fact, if you look at the listing, it says publishing abandoned.
Right.
Now, this is actually for a different book. It has the same title, and the book was originally going to be published by a company called Feral House, which is a US publisher. And they've published some books by Richard Hoagland. They published Dark Mission by Richard Hoagland and some of Joseph Farrell's books. So they were originally going to publish the book, but without going into all the details, I've written a bit of an article about this recently, or partly about this. They ended up not publishing the book, but they still, even though they weren't going to publish it, they maintained that they were going to, they maintained the listings.
Right. So this was written by Dr. Judy Wood, but am I right in thinking that they wanted to change what she had written? Therefore, she didn't approve of that particular book.
Well, what started to happen when they were working on this book was that there were various problems in that various edits were done on the script, which weren't what, they were basically trying to cut the book down because they had to get it into a certain number of pages. They were cutting out certain pictures, and then certain bits of text were rewritten, and it really got to the point that it wasn't going to be representative of the evidence.
Right.
And that was the problem. They were, you do need a good number of pages to do the evidence justice. There's a lot of evidence to be considered and analysed, and that's what the book, why it exists in that form, is to do just justice to the evidence, because it's such an important topic.
To say that if you want to be guaranteed of getting the correct version, it will be for sale on the RichPlanet.net website. So if you buy it off RichPlanet.net, you will get the correct version. I mean, I don't know whether the other version is in print.
No, the other version is actually not in print. It's never got to the printing stage, at least not as far as we know.
Right.
And I, basically tried to find out a bit more about why these listings were appearing, and I ended up finding out that Feral House, the publisher, actually also published Ian Brady's book, The Gates of Janus. Now, for people who don't know who Ian Brady is, he's actually a serial killer, a convicted serial killer, one of the Moors murderers, in fact.
So this was the publisher who was wanting to publish the previous version?
Yes, yes. So,
right. Now, I mean, how much is it, Andrew?
The cover price in the UK will be £25, plus with it being a book that weighs about £3.
Quite a heavy book.
Yeah, it's a heavy book, so it's heavy to post. So it's
going to be £30
yeah,
including postage.
£30 all in. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
and there are 800 photographs,
yes,
diagrams, and it's 500 pages.
It is on, it's on a par with a university textbook. It's that sort of league of textbook, and it's that sort of price range. I know it's going to be outside the price range of some people. Yeah. But if we're hoping to get it into some libraries and stuff like that, so even if you can't afford to buy it,
and people can go on Dr. Judy Wood's website if they can't afford the book, which is
DrJudyWood.com. A lot of the the main bits of evidence you'll find there. There's various sort of write-ups on there as well.
Give us your website address, Andrew.
www.checktheevidence.com.
Now, you've published a book as well, Andrew.
Correct.
Can you just briefly tell us about that? Your book is more about the skullduggery going on in 9/11 research. Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely. My book is called 9/11 Finding the Truth, and I suppose my book is a bit like a diary of certain events which happened during the creation of that book. Right. And how people were fighting to cover up the evidence. And what we're now finding with that book is people are now going to try and take ownership of the evidence. In other words, say that they thought of it first, or they think it doesn't mean what, it doesn't nothing to do with the Hutchison effect, it's to do with, say, torsion field physics. That's already started to happen now that the book is out.
Yeah, because I believe Richard Hoagland, the American researcher who used to work for NASA, as a librarian, I think.
A curator, yeah.
A curator. Yeah. He gave a talk where he spent a lot of time covering Dr. Judy Wood's work, which you were quite keen to correct, shall we say, certain things that he said in his talk.
That's right. I mean, we had this conference in Amsterdam. Just spent a minute or two talking about that because it's important, again, that people realise not only the evidence in that book, but the level of importance that it is has meant that people like Richard Hoagland have had to try and muscle in on the action to change the interpretation that people are going to get from it. He did this talk in Amsterdam. He spoke about the evidence in that book not for 5 minutes, but for an hour and a half. He never contacted Dr. Judy Wood beforehand, either to consult her, to tell her that he was going to do it, or to ask her permission. He reused a couple of pictures from my website without credit or permission. I don't mind people using my stuff, but at least he could have credited the website. He got various things wrong. That was the main thing. I wouldn't have minded using my stuff if he got stuff right. He basically said that John Hutchison was in the Navy. I wrote to John Hutchison was never in the Navy. He said that John Hutchison was evicted. He said that Judy Wood had started a court case to get documents revealed. That's not what the court case was about. The court case was about science fraud, and it implicated 3 military-industrial complex companies who helped write the NIST reports. Richard Hoagland didn't mention any of that. He got that all completely wrong.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's a fine line because you don't want to scare people from giving talks and sending out information about the work. You know, but obviously they need to get facts correct.
That's it. I
mean, it is, for all, it's not full of equations or anything.
No, there are some
there are some, but it's a fairly scientific document.
Right.
So if someone is going to try and read 500 pages and then give a lecture on it, I mean, I wouldn't. That would be a big challenge for me to do.
Yes.
Because you don't want to misrepresent what Dr. Judy Wood is saying, because I know that she is extremely careful in how she presents. She doesn't make any assumptions. She doesn't draw any conclusions. She's very, very evidence-based.
That's right.
And other people then, the danger is, will take that and draw false conclusions.
That's basically what's been happening, and it is a problem. you know, and the point about what Richard Hoagland did was he didn't consult. You know, and Dr. Wood wasn't invited to that conference. You know, in other words, somebody like Richard Hoagland could easily have rung Dr. Judy up and said, "Look, I'd like to do a segment on this. If I do the first, you know, 20 minutes, can you take over and get, you know, describe the evidence that you've gathered and the conclusions that you've come to in the second half an hour, 40 minutes, 1 hour?" You know, there's nothing to have stopped somebody like him doing that if he wanted to give it an honest shot.
Just to, you know, Richard Hoagland has done some fantastic work on Mars and you know, the solar system. And
I mean, Richard Hoagland, he has got a strong following.
We're not saying, oh, everything's bad about Richard Hoagland, but we're just saying that representing this work in a talk is probably not the easiest thing to do, because it's of a technical nature and it's a very specific nature. The things that she's saying are specific. So, you know, it needs to be represented correctly.
That's right. And the odd thing is that he didn't even have a copy of the book before the talk. He first referenced this research, Dr. Judy Wood's research, in February 2010, a year ago. Yet he's never contacted either of us in the intervening time, never said that he was going to talk about this. So we're very puzzled as to the timing of this.
All right, Andrew. Now, what about, you know, obviously, if this book's going to have any impact and those who perpetrated this act are brought to justice, you know, where has this, surely the politicians have got to be reading this book. You know, the American president has to read this book, ideally, or those who control the American president. How do you get this politically recognised?
Well, I think that's going to be very, very difficult. I mean, my experience up to now, I certainly haven't approached anyone yet because, frankly, I'm quite disillusioned with all the people that are in any of the power structures. I don't really feel that they can deal with this evidence because it undermines most of the political and hierarchical structures by which we live. For example, you're looking at a totally different type of science behind this, a kind of black science, if you will. My own effort in this direction wasn't so much with this book itself, but, you know, a couple of years ago I wrote to various military people and RAF bases, and I basically told them that you know, this technology was out there and this is what was used, because
this was British military bases you wrote to, wasn't it?
That you know, the letters are in my book, they're on my website too, so you can go and read what I wrote to them. And I tried to put it down in 2 pages, you know, and I basically...
You got a visit, didn't you, from 2
I did,
guys in suits?
yes, I did.
Right.
Yeah, that was about 3 months after I wrote the letters.
Right.
They claimed to be from Derbyshire Police, but I don't think they were from Derbyshire CID, but I'm pretty sure they went from Derbyshire CID.
You were informing the military that the US Black Ops military...
Well, I don't know if it was the US, but I said that some black technology,
Someone has got technology which is capable of doing this. You know, and I'm just letting you know this.
That was basically what I did. I said, here's the information, here's where to find it. Go and check this out, because I think you need to come to your own conclusions about this, because I think it was very important. So I've tried to already, you know, 2 years ago, I tried to put the information in front of military people, not so much politicians, because I'd spent 4 years previous to that writing to my own MP and not really getting any useful sort of feedback from that particularly.
All right then, Andrew. Is there anything else you want to say before we finish?
Well, I'd just like to say that you know, I hope people can take a look at this book. It is of what you know, we call it a forensic study because that's what it is. It's the only forensic study available of the evidence of what happened at the World Trade Center. And you know, people that have read the book so far have found it's quite revelatory. There's a lot in there that you will never have seen before, and it proves beyond any doubt that the buildings didn't even hit the ground. In other words, the buildings were completely destroyed before they hit the ground, and it proves that probably in 4 or 5 different ways. So, you know, get hold of it, have a look at it, and come to your own conclusion.
All right, Andrew. Thanks very much indeed for being with us again. It's been a pleasure talking to you as usual. And it just remains for me to say, keep your eyes on the skies, keep your feet on the ground, and tell all your friends about this show. bullshit.
Precaution.
Now, the other two broad theories, I would suggest, are firstly that the towers were rigged with explosives, conventional explosives, which created a standard controlled demolition. And I would say, out of people who are demanding 9/11 truth, it's probably the favoured viewpoint. Now, there's another viewpoint, which is, well, it's not another viewpoint. Dr. Judy Wood has looked at the evidence, and this is it's a study. It's probably the most detailed scientific study of the evidence. Would you say that's correct, Andrew?
Absolutely. I mean, the book itself runs to 500 pages, you know, and you'll find about 800 pictures, various graphs.
800 pictures,
Yeah.
which are all annotated.
Yeah, pretty much, or most of them, you know,
I mean,
many of them are
it's
annotated.
like it's a textbook, essentially,
Yeah,
isn't it,
it's
Andrew?
essentially done as a textbook,
Right.
but it's written in a very readable style. So, you know, you're going to find a catalogue of evidence at quite short notice, this particular programme. It's difficult to get her over here due to the expense, and she's also got certain commitments where she is at the moment, so it would be difficult to bring her over to do a broadcast here. You know, we thought of doing it over Skype. I think I discussed that with you, but
Right.
that's not ideal.
All right. Now, the subtitle of the book is Evidence of Directed Free Energy Technology on 9/11, and we'll go into some detail shortly.
Right.
But just broadly, in my opinion, there are three broad theories on what happened to the towers on the day of 9/11. Now, the first one, which is held by victims of mainstream media brainwashing, is that the planes, alleged planes, caused structural damage and fires, which then caused these quarter-mile high steel structures to just fall like pancakes. That's the first theory, which most people who look at 9/11 for more than 10 minutes realise that that's just...
Basically, a professor of mechanical engineering. She's got specialism in materials engineering science and engineering mechanics, and then she ended up specialising in what's called interference techniques, particularly optics, which is what you use for stress analysis. In other words, you want to test materials and how they'll respond to various loads, and some of her research was involved with biomaterials.
All right.
And how they would behave under stress.
All right. Now, the book itself is predominantly about what happened to the buildings after the attacks had occurred on 9/11. It doesn't concern itself too much with the actual, we'll call them impacts, but why did the towers disappear, for want of a better word? And we'll go into it in a little more detail later on. But does Judy Wood not travel around the world? I mean, you were telling me why she couldn't be in the UK.
Well, I mean, we've done this.
And how long has Judy been working on this, Andrew?
Well, I mean, essentially that book, you could sort of argue, is the result of, you know, almost 10 years of research, because Dr. Wood, if you go and listen to some of the broadcasts she's done, she describes how she was very suspicious on the very day that it happened, that it wasn't as we were shown. There was something very seriously wrong. And you know, she can obviously tell that story much better than I can, but she began to publish research sort of to share with a couple of people that she was speaking to in about sort of 2004, and has developed it, and the website, the current website, was essentially started in about early 2007 or late 2006. So you know, she's been really working on it for at least intensively for at least 4 years in the sort of form that it's developed into now.
So what's her qualifications first?
Right. Well, yes. I mean, she's
Welcome on board the RichPlanet starship, broadcasting from somewhere high above the Earth. I'm Richard D. Hall. On this week's show, for a fourth appearance, to talk about what has been described by an English professor as the most important book of the 21st century, Where Did the Towers Go?, written by former Professor of Mechanical Engineering, Dr. Judy Wood. I'd like to welcome back 9/11 Truth campaigner, Andrew Johnson. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks for inviting me back, Richard.
It's a pleasure. Now, I've got Dr. Judy Wood's book here, Andrew, which you're going to talk about today.